What would you do if an entire hall turned against you? If every laugh, every whisper, and every stare burned into your skin like fire? One man stood in that very storm, trembling hands, a dry throat, a crowd ready to tear him down. But in the middle of his humiliation, something changed. A silence fell. A spark appeared. And with a single step, he transformed mockery into respect. The same voices that laughed began to rise with him. The same crowd that mocked began to chant his name. This is the story of how dignity shattered humiliation, and how one moment of courage set fire to an entire movement. Stay until the end, because what happens next will leave you speechless. Asterisk from humiliation to honor, how dignity changed everything. The hall was silent, yet the silence was heavy. Wooden. Chairs creaked as restless bodies shifted. A faint smell of old paper and varnish lingered in the air. The lights above buzzed, their glow sharp against the pale walls. He stood at the center, his hands trembling. All eyes were fixed on him there. Stares pressed against his skin like burning coals. His throat felt dry, his tongue heavy, his breath uneven. Someone coughed at the back, the sound slicing the silence. The echo of laughter followed, soft but cruel. Heat spread across his face, red with shame. He lowered his gaze, staring at the cracks in the floor. Every whisper felt like a dagger, every smirk like a strike against his chest. He wanted to vanish, to dissolve into the air. But the moment held him captive. The paper in his hand shook, his vision blurred. Not from tears, but from the storm rising within. He felt his heart pound against his ribs, fast and relentless. His ears rang, drowning out the voices, drowning out the world. And then the silence shifted. A voice rose, firm and commanding. Breaking the cruel rhythm of scorn, all heads turned. The air thickened, charged with something unseen. The floor beneath him seemed to steady, as if waiting for his next step. He lifted his eyes. For the first time, he saw something different. Not ridicule, not disdain, but a spark of recognition. Would you like me to continue building the next sequence, where this spark slowly transforms into the shocking turning point? Asterisk, not ridicule, not disdain, but a spark of recognition. It came from the eyes of a man seated near the front. His posture was upright, his face calm, his gaze unshaken. The man did not laugh. He did not whisper. He simply watched, steady as stone. Yet, alive with meaning, the trembling in his hands eased. The paper no longer felt like a burden, but a shield. The storm inside shifted, turning from fear to fire. He drew a breath deep and heavy, filling his chest. The sound of it seemed louder than the murmurs around him. He spoke, and his voice cracked the silence. Not soft, not broken, but sharp. Rising from the place where his shame had lived, the hall changed. The whispers fell. The laughter died. Eyes that once pierced him with mockery now blinked in surprise. Each word he spoke carried weight, each phrase striking like thunder. The air seemed to lean closer, as though the walls themselves listened. And in that stillness, something shifted again, a hush not of scorn, but of awe. A silence not of cruelty, but of respect. For the first time, they were not looking at his weakness. They were witnessing his strength. The moment that began with humiliation now swelled with something unshakable, something that felt like honor. Asterisk, something that felt like honor. The weight on his chest no longer crushed him. It lifted, as if dignity itself had wrapped around his shoulders. Every face before him looked changed. The smirks had vanished. The mocking eyes had softened. Some looked away, unable to meet his gaze. Others leaned forward, caught in the grip of his words, and then it happened. The very same man who had laughed the loudest only moments before stood up. His chair scraped against the floor, sharp and harsh. The sound cut through the room like a blade. The man's face was pale, his smile gone, his eyes restless. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The silence pressed against him, heavier than it had ever been, on the one they had mocked. Now the weight of humiliation had shifted. Now the eyes of the hall burned into him, and in that instant, balance of power was undone. Dignity had changed everything. Asterisk dignity had changed everything. The hall felt different now, so the walls themselves leaned closer to witness. Breathless silence filled the space, heavy yet electric. The man who once mocked could not bear the stares. His lips trembled. His hands clenched at his sides. For the first time, he looked small, so very small. The crowd that once laughed with him now watched in cold stillness. A murmur rippled through the back rows. Sharp as a hiss, whispers grew, swelling like a rising tide. But the tide was not against the one who had been shamed. It surged against the mocker. A chair tipped, a foot stamped, voices rose in low fury. He stepped back, his pride crumbling under the weight of their judgment. And the one who had stood trembling only moments ago, he did not move. He stood tall, unmoving, his silence stronger than any shout. The air grew thick, and everyone felt it. The shift was complete. Humiliation had left. Him, honor now surrounded him, and the crowd was no longer his enemy. Asterisk, and the crowd was no longer his enemy. The silence broke, not with laughter, but with a single clap. It echoed sharply across the hall, startling everyone. Another followed, then another. The sound grew, multiplying, rolling like thunder through the roomed applause, strong, unstoppable. The very walls seemed to tremble with it. He felt the floor steady beneath his feet. It's no longer fragile, no longer uncertain. The sound struck the mocker hardest. Each clap was a hammer. Against his pride, shattering what he once believed unshakable, the man's shoulders sank, his head lowered, his power gone. And in that instant, the roles were reversed. The one they had ridiculed stood in honor. The one who had mocked stood in shame. Yet the story did not end with applause. For within the noise, a voice suddenly rose above the rest. It was loud, trembling, but filled with something raw. It shouted words that no one expected, words that froze the applause midair. The hall went silent once again. Every face turned, waiting, breath caught, hearts pounding. The moment hung on the edge of something greater, something shocking. Asterisk something shocking, the voice cried out, clear and cutting. He was right all along. The words split the air like lightning. Gasps rippled through the hall. Some froze in disbelief. Others exchanged uneasy glances. The mocker's face turned pale, drained of all defiance. The one who stood in honor did not flinch. His eyes remained steady, fixed ahead, unshaken. The crowd shifted, their silence no longer empty. It was charged, restless, alive with something dangerous. One by one, they began to stand. Not for the Amerknot, for the laughter of the past, but for the truth that had just been spoken. The hall that once suffocated him with shame now trembled with a new weight. The weight of awakening. The sound of chairs scraping against the floor grew louder, building like a storm. The mocker stumbled backward, his power crumbling faster with every second, and in the center, the one they once humiliated stood taller than ever, unmoving. The world around him was no longer the same. Asterisk, the world around him was no longer the same. The air itself seemed to vibrate, thick with unspoken resolve. Eyes that once mocked now blazed with fire. Feet shuffled, voices rumbled. The crowd was no longer still. A hand rose from the front row, clenched into a fist. Another followed, then another. Dozens of fists lifted. Silent but fierce, as if the hall itself had chosen a side. The mocker staggered, his back nearly pressed against the wall. His voice broke as he tried to speak, but no sound carried. The weight of their stares crushed him, heavier than stone. And, in that moment, he was the one stripped bare. He was the one trembling, the one they once humiliated did not speak. He did not need to. His silence filled the space with more force than words. It was dignity made flesh. It was on a rising where shame had once ruled, and then the crowd erupted, not with chaos, not with cruelty, but with a roar of unity that shook the very beams above their heads. The sound was overwhelming, relentless, unstoppable. The mocker collapsed into his chair, powerless, and in that roar, a single truth became clear to all. Dignity had not only changed him, it had changed them. Dignity had not only changed him, it had changed them. The roar did not fade quickly, it rolled through the hall. Wave after wave, a sound too vast to be contained by walls. Someone opened the heavy doors at the back. The noise spilled into the street, raw and unrestrained. People outside turned, curious, then drawn closer by the power of the sound. Faces appeared in the doorway, strangers peering in, their eyes wide. The hall was no longer just a hall. It was becoming something larger, something alive. The man at the center still stood silent, but his silence commanded more than speeches ever could. He felt the air shift again, no longer heavy, but charged with purpose. The mocker kept his head down, his presence shrinking into nothing. No one looked at him anymore. All eyes belonged to the one who had endured, and then it happened. From the back, a young boy stepped forward. His clothes were worn, his face pale, his hands clutching a battered book. He walked slowly, each step echoing louder than the roar had moments before. The hall fell quiet, as though waiting for him alone. The boy stopped before the man raised his trembling hand and spoke. His voice was soft, yet it carried like thunder. "Teach us, teach us." The word struck deeper than any cheer. The hall was frozen, yet alive. Every breath caught and waiting. The boy's small frame stood against the silence like a spark in the dark. The man looked down, his hands no longer trembling. The paper he once feared to hold now felt meaningless, for what was written there could not compare to what now burned in their eyes. More voices rose, scattered at first, then gathering strength. "Teach us, show us, lead us." The sound grew, rising from every corner of the hall. It surged like a tide, fierce and unstoppable. The man who had once been humiliated felt the weight of their plea pressing upon him. It was not the weight of scorn, it was the weight of trust. The mocker, forgotten and shrunken, slipped deeper into his chair, swallowed by his own silence. But the man at the center did not move away. He lifted his head slowly, his eyes sweeping across the crowd, and what he saw was no longer ridicule, it was devotion. It was the birth of something greater than himself. The hall trembled not with laughter, not with shame, but with awakening. A single step forward would change everything. A single step forward would change everything. His foot touched the wooden floor, steady and firm. The sound of that step rang louder than the roar that had shaken the hall. The crowd leaned closer, hearts thundering in unison. Every eye followed him. Every breath waited for him. He raised his head, and for the first time, he spoke. Without fear, his voice was clear, carrying to every corner. "If you want dignity, then stand with me." The words struck like fire cast into dry grass. The hall erupted, not in noise alone, but in movement. Men and women rose from their chairs. The boy clutched his book tighter, his face lit with hope. Strangers pressed through the doors, pulled by the force of something they could not name. The very air shook. Alive with resolve, the mocker sat frozen, buried beneath the wave that no longer belonged to him. This moment had passed him by. The man at the center was no longer alone. He had become the voice of all who were silent. The flame of dignity now burned in every heart before him. And it was only the beginning. And it was only the beginning. The doors of the hall stood wide open now. The noise spilled into the streets. Like a river breaking its banks, people outside stopped in their tracks, their eyes drawn to the roar of voices within. Mothers, carrying baskets, workers with dirt still on their hands, children chasing each other through the dust, All froze. Listening, their faces pulled toward the sound of change. The boy was the first to run out, his battered book pressed to his chest. He shouted the words he had just heard. "If you want dignity, then stand with us." The phrase leapt from mouth to mouth, carried by breath, carried by hope. Shutters opened, windows filled with faces, feet hurried toward the hall, as though the earth itself pulled them forward. What began as one trembling man now swelled into a crowd, fierce and unyielding. The mocker slipped away unnoticed, his shadow swallowed by the rising storm. But the man at the center did not falter. He stood as they poured in, the fire in their eyes reflecting his own, and with every voice that joined, the sound grew heavier, greater, unstoppable. The hall could no longer contain it. It was spilling into the world beyond. It was spilling into the world beyond. The sound rolled through the narrow streets, rattling doors and windows. It reached corners where silence had ruled for years, and it reached ears that did not welcome it. From the distance came the sharp rhythm of boots against stone, heavy, unforgiving. The crowd stiffened, their voices faltering. For the first time, the air that moments ago burned with fire now chilled with unease. Shadows stretched as uniformed men appeared at the far end of the street. Their steps were steady, their eyes cold, their presence like a blade cutting into the rising storm. The people near the doors looked back, fear flickering across their faces. Children were pulled close. Whispers of retreat rippled, thin and weak. But at the center he did not move. His stance was tall, his silence louder than the approaching boots. The soldiers came closer, their armor gleaming under the pale light. The crowd's roar was gone. Only breathless waiting remained. And in that waiting, all eyes turned to him once more. Would he falter now? Would dignity bend under the weight of force? He lifted his head slowly, meeting the gaze of power without a tremor. And then he stepped forward. And then he stepped forward. The wooden boards groaned beneath his weight. His stride did not break. Each movement was steady, deliberate. Unshaken, the soldiers tightened their formation, boots striking harder against the ground. Steel glimmered at their sides. Polished and merciless, the crowd held its breath, hearts pounding like a single drum. Mothers pressed children close. Men clenched their fists, yet none dared to move ahead of him. The air was thick enough to choke. Heavy with fear and defiance, the lead soldier raised his hand, and the line of men halted. Dust swirled around their boots, caught in the stillness. Silence gripped the street. The soldier's voice rang out, sharp as a blade. "Disperse, or you will be crushed." The words cut deep, echoing off stone walls. Some in the crowd flinched. Others lowered their eyes, but he did not. He stood taller, his chest rising with a breath that seemed to shake the very air, and then his voice came, steady and piercing. "We are already crushed when we bow to humiliation." The words struck like thunder. The crowd gasped. The soldiers stiffened. Even the lead soldier's eyes flickered with something he could not hide. For a moment, the weight of weapons seemed smaller than the weight of those words. For a moment. Time seemed to hold its breath. The crowd looked from the soldiers to the man who stood unbroken. Fear lingered, but dignity burned brighter. One by one, voices rose, not shouts of anger, but words of strength. "We will not bow." The phrase spread, echoing from every throat. Building into a tide, the soldiers shifted uneasily, their formation trembling against the force of unity. The lead soldier's hand wavered, his command lost beneath the roar of many. The people no longer hid behind silence. They no longer bent beneath scorn. They stood, shoulder to shoulder, their eyes lifted with pride, and in that moment, humiliation was gone. In its place stood something unshakable. Honor, dignity. The man who had once trembled was no longer alone. He had given them more than words. He had given them the strength to rise, and together, it became the proof that dignity could change everything. Asterisk.